I'd like also to start tonight by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country we're on tonight, Wiradjuri country. Pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and particularly to acknowledge that we're on country whose sovereignty has never been ceded. And I don't think we can say that enough. In fact, I know we can't. And every time we say it, we are acknowledging a profound truth and a profound and ongoing injustice whose pain continues to be felt from the brutality of our colonial past. I also want to say that what I'm about to talk about, I do so very much within the front of my mind, the knowledge that no matter how much pain we non-Indigenous people may have felt around the subject that we're talking about tonight and that you're all here for, that we magnify that pain when we consider the issue of suicide amongst Indigenous Australians. And it is just another mark of that injustice. Tonight, I was going to, and in fact I'd very carefully prepared some comments that I thought might be useful to reflect on about the state of our country and its impact on our mental health. And it was never quite right until I confronted the fact that what I was avoiding really was spending serious time talking about my brother. I was going to talk briefly about Paul and then go on to these other things, and I've basically thrown that away. And I'm going to talk substantially about Paul Kerry O'Brien. On the 27th of August 1952, at the age of 7, I received a telegram. I was staying at my grandmother's place, my grandparents' place in Brisbane. My mother was giving birth to her fourth child. He was to be my kid brother in Warwick. And the telegram said, "Baby boy born on Kerry's birthday." Paul was not expected. Paul was not planned. And when Paul arrived, he was special. He was particularly special to my mother. Special partly because of the circumstance of his arrival, but also because she sensed something vulnerable in Paul. And she was right, although it took a long time to manifest. Paul and I shared a bedroom through my teen years. Even at that age, in my own foolish way, I wanted to ease his path by making some things a little easier for him than they might have been for me. Instinctively, I wanted to help Paul. He was very bright. He was full of curiosity. He was a compassionate human being even in his young years. There was an instinctiveness, an instinctive kindness in him. He excelled as a sportsman. He played in the first 15 as fullback at his school in Brisbane. And for those of you almost Victorians who are steeped in Australian rules, I'm talking about rugby. He also competed at state level in athletics. After university, he tried various career paths, not really sticking at any of them. I had no doubt that had he been able to apply himself, he would have had a successful career. But he always veered off, and eventually he became a globetrotter. At one point, I saw him as a vagabond in the most romantic sense of vagabond, and I told him so. He didn't like that. He saw it almost as a pejorative term. Paul eventually was diagnosed with schizophrenia, and things began to make some sense. And so he would come and he would go, he would disappear overseas, he would come back, he would work for a while, he couldn't sustain his work. At times he would live in a combi van and he'd drive the combi van around the country. What we didn't really know until later was how many friends he was making and how many lives he was touching. He would periodically drop into my home in Sydney and rekindle his bonds with my children, and then he'd go again. And that was his life. He represented no harm to others, and we thought no harm to himself. When he was diagnosed with schizophrenia, our mother confided in we siblings, but we weren't allowed to acknowledge it to Paul because he had sworn her to secrecy, he thought. And she had made that promise to him, but of course she's a mother, and she felt she owed it to us and she owed it to him that we should know. But we couldn't talk to him about it. And then he was diagnosed with aplastic anemia, a blood disorder, which was almost certainly going to be fatal because it required a bone marrow transplant. And my sister Barbara, my brother Tony and I all tested, but were not compatible. And the doctors explained to us that the odds of them finding an anonymous person somewhere out in the world who would be compatible were infinitesimal. So, in Paul's 40th year, my wife and kids and I came up to Queensland, as we always did around Christmas, to spend a week with my parents in their retirement on the Gold Coast. And Paul moved between the Gold Coast and Brisbane, and then we were going up to the Sunshine Coast for a week. We saw Paul, but he was not in a good way. He was having to go to the hospital on a very regular basis and sit there for hours having transfusions. And on one occasion, my brother Tony and I went with him. And we got to the hospital and Paul was getting increasingly nervous. And as we went to get into the lift, he pulled back and he said, "You're going to have me committed, aren't you?" I said, "Paul, I don't know what you're saying. This would not have occurred to us. Why would you think that?" He said, "Because the psychiatric unit is in this hospital." And we had to slowly persuade him to join us in the lift to walk up to where he was to have his transfusion. He was standing there at the lift door sweating. And when he did eventually hesitantly come into the lift, he stood looking at us, shivering. He was like a cornered animal. 3 days later, as we were preparing to leave for the Sunshine Coast, I got a call from Paul. He was just calling to say goodbye, he said. And we talked briefly. We said our goodbyes. And as I got into the car, I said to my wife, "There's something that's not quite right." And I felt very uneasy. When we arrived at our hotel on the Sunshine Coast, there was a message to ring my sister Barbara. Paul had walked off a roof at the CWA hostel in Brisbane, where he was staying because he also used the Brisbane hospital down the road. He hadn't died immediately. They kept him alive until I got there. We said our goodbyes. And the memory that I will take to my own grave is of looking into my mother's eyes. Never mind my own grief, but looking into my mother's eyes and seeing the raw pain and the agony and that lost look, this woman who had nursed this boy right through his life, trying to come to terms with what had happened, and that this was his departure. And so, this is the first time really, apart from a few fairly carefully chosen words that I put into a memoir a couple of years ago, this is the first time I've really spoken publicly about it, and I guess in the 28 years since that happened, I parked that grief privately, and every now and then it would just come back and revisit me. And it's only now, as I face trying to put these things into words, and I'm doing it for me, I realise, as much as I'm trying to do it for you, that I understand how important it is that we share, and how the denial of grief is itself a canker that eats away at us and erodes us, and how brave you all are. You know, we saw two remarkable women tonight on this stage, and what an extraordinary year it is for strong, passionate, compassionate, powerful, brave, injured women who are coming to the fore in this country to inspire us all. As a journalist over 50-something years now, 55 actually, but who's counting, I have seen the progress of mental health debate, and I've seen the course of the development of our capacity to deal with mental illness. And it is, of course, there are some great and inspirational moments, and there are some wonderful people, health professionals working in mental health. But this is a saga of neglect. It is not a sexy political issue. And the stigma that I witnessed as a child and witnessed as a journalist all those years ago has not left us yet. We see prominent people finding the courage and the need to come to the fore and talk about their own mental illnesses for the good of us all. And you think, well, maybe we can move past the stigma of mental illness. Maybe we can. And then I see, for instance, a young, talented tennis player named Naomi Osaka forced to tell the world that she's been suffering long bouts of depression since she won the US Open in 2018. And she's felt compelled to do that because it's the only way she can justify not turning up to a press conference and being stigmatised for that. So when I see the mishandling of that situation and how that compounds the pressure on her, that tells me that we still have a very long way to go. And when I remember back to my childhood and the way the man who lived on the corner, he would have been in his late 30s, I guess, he had a couple of kids. He was unremarkable really, but he communicated with other people in the street. Everyone knew his name. They knew his basic story. And then one day, the word was sort of around that he was having troubles. And then he disappeared for a while. And when he came back, he was a very different man, and the word filtered out. As my mother explained to me some years later, he'd had a frontal lobotomy. And in my young mind, I noted, because I've recalled it since, what a different presence he had after that. He had no job from then on. He couldn't hold down a job. But he would climb onto the bus with his satchel and he would sit straight, staring fixedly ahead as he drove alone or rode alone on the bus into the city. How he would walk around the streets, and I have no memory of anyone. I cannot remember seeing anybody talking to him. I can remember as a young journalist being overwhelmed as I reported on an institution, a mental hospital in Melbourne, where some whistleblowers were starting to reveal the kinds of things that were going on behind the scenes, which really were reflective of many mental health institutions, not just around Australia. Reflective, I might say, of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, for those of you who've read the book or seen the film, where people were basically reduced to a vegetative state, where they were tranquilised virtually out of existence, often as out of convenience. And so what passed for treatment was really a sham for so many of those people. And then as we did the stories, more and more people would ring up to talk about their own circumstances. And in the end, after months of this, I had to walk away from that story. So 50s, 70s, 90s, when my brother Paul was treated in silos with his physical ailments and his mental illness, these things were seen as separate things. And when he was in hospital for his physical treatments, staff would complain that he could be difficult. And they were not seeing the reason for the difficulty was Paul's anxiety and determination to exercise his right to question what they were doing with him and what the treatment was. And the other silo of his mental health treatment was over there. That was the 90s. And we have to ask the question still today, how much further do we have to go? And how much really has changed? I still now, in my 75th year and my 55th year as a journalist, I still hear stories that are echoes of the past, of people who fall through the cracks in the system, of people who present to hospitals in crisis, are treated, are let go, back into the community, back into the situation where the crisis developed, and some of whom do not survive because the community support for them that our politicians tell us is there is so inadequate. So we can take some little joy from the last federal budget, where we see $200 and something million has been allocated to treatment centres and to suicide prevention. But from everything I have seen and everything I know about government's treatments of mental health is that promises in the past have almost invariably ended in disappointment. And while you can take some relief and some reassurance and even some pride in your own contribution to the debate which has led to this government's acknowledgement that this is a problem that desperately needs to be responded to far better than it has in the past, what we have to keep in the fronts of our mind is that you do not relax. There is no relaxation on this, because what is given can be taken away, and what is given almost invariably turns out to be way short of what it needs to be. I wasn't sure, to be honest, that I would get through talking about this tonight, but I'm very pleased that I have, and I feel enormously privileged to have shared the stage with those who've been here tonight. But the reason that I have come is to pay my respects to Annette and Stuart Baker and to all those others of you who have become a part of this very special process, to confront yourselves, but confront the rest of us as well, with the anguish and the pain which is at the heart of this. And to tell you that you are doing something special which flies in the face of the direction our entire world is going at the moment. The democratic world is lost. The democratic world is in an enveloping crisis. The democratic world is polarising. Our politicians are polarised. Our media is polarised. We live in a privileged and wealthy society. We're living in exciting times where there is breakthrough after breakthrough on so many fronts that promise to improve our lives, that promise us so many things. We have never been in a technological sense, more connected in this globe than we are now. But this world is full of contradictions, because while we have this connectedness, we also have extraordinary isolation. There are so many lonely, anxious people walking the face of this earth and walking around this country who are struggling for help, to help them out of that isolation, out of that anxiety, out of that alienation. Connection is so much a part of what we require to lead a healthy existence, to live in a civil society. We are losing the capacity to talk across a growing divide. Once upon a time, we didn't think anything remarkable about talking politics with people who might have a different political view to ourselves, different social views to ourselves. I think we are on the way to losing that capacity. And mental health is very much at the heart of what I'm talking about here. It is fundamental. So I want to leave it there, but again say to you, this has been a marvellous experience for me to see you turn out in the depths of the Albury-Wodonga winter, to do what you are doing, to say what you are saying, and to hope that what you're doing here will grow, and that more and more people will come to understand that in community lies strength. We find compassion amongst ourselves. We learn to talk more openly with each other. We learn to be kinder to each other. Thank you very much.